innovate, and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
Scientific discoveries show that your brain can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point. The Center for Brain Health can show you how to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
We learned from a national poll that 95% of people want to do something about their brains. The problem is they don't know where or how to start. At the Center for Brain Health, we have easy-to-use, scientifically proven tools to provide people a proactive path to do just that, to help people everywhere improve their quality of life through brain health. What's exciting is that it's easy to start, and starting is urgent because we are in a brain health crisis.
So how do you boost your brain power? How can better brain health help you focus on what's most important?
Brain training is a part of the way that we would distinguish ourselves from others. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be commonplace in businesses in years to come.
We are seeing an epidemic of mental health concerns. Stress and overload lead to depression, anxiety, and burnout. Our brains hold the key to navigate these hurdles. It's never too soon to start.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Research shows training middle schoolers how to think, problem solve, and innovate significantly improves academic achievement. Even more importantly, it enhances confidence and well-being for them to thrive throughout their lives.
It really helps the kid and it builds their stamina. I genuinely credit my success in the classroom from this program.
The key to the future is stronger brain health for individuals and communities. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Anyway, so that's brand new for those of you who have seen these before. Obviously, we updated that, so great job for our team for doing that. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize is we are a not-for-profit. And tonight I wanted to thank the Rouse Family Foundation and KERA for our sponsorship tonight. Without groups like them and individuals like them, we would not be able to do these things. So thank you very much. So again, now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sandra Chapman and Dr. Matt Walker.
Great. Well, tonight is going to be such a special night. I want you to enjoy it. I feel like this is a reunion.
It's been some time.
We invited Dr. Walker to speak to us 13 years ago when he was just a pup, 35.
Yeah.
So
and now I'm solidly in the foothills of middle age, and I'm.
But what an honor to have him. Followed his work. What's so interesting? He has so many TED Talks. His last one in 2019 was literally watched 1 million times in less than 3 days. That tells you about the star power of this amazing scientist, and you'll love his accent. It's from Liverpool. He's a professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. He is director of the Center for Human Sleep Science. Prior to going to Berkeley, he was at Harvard University in the Department of Psychiatry. He's appeared on 60 Minutes, Nova, BBC News, NPR, and now he can add Brain Health Presents.
Top of the CV list.
And his mission in life, what's so amazing about Matt is while he's wicked smart, curious, genius, He really wants to help humanity to find better ways to sleep. Each of us, because he calls it the magic elixir. So please join me and welcome him as we have our conversation, Dr. Matt Walker.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for that, or both you and Steve, for the incredibly kind comments. It's always anxiety provoking when people sort of, are clapping so loudly before you've said anything. And therefore, I feel I already owe you for that round of applause. So I will try and be on my best game. Thank you for having me here again. And thank you for turning up this evening.
Yeah, so great. And you'll want to get his book, Why We Sleep. I tell you, I prioritize sleep. My husband, Don, knows that. But after I read his book, now I think about what I'm doing that day and think, did I get enough sleep to do that or not? And that's what you're going to think after tonight. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is, we've talked a lot about changing time, changing our time periods, and even flying across time zones. Tell us what you did because of your 2-hour time difference from Berkeley to Dallas. What did you do to adjust so you could be top of your game tonight?
Good question. So since this was such a short trip, I arrived yesterday and I will return tomorrow. I'm largely going to hold on to Californian time when that happens. But there are some things that I've done, and then there are some pieces of advice more generally for sort of jet lag and travel. What I certainly did today was I got exercise first thing in the morning, and I try to do that fairly consistently most days of my life. As you undoubtedly know from this center, physical activity in addition to a good night of sleep is essential for your brain health. And so that was the first thing. The second thing is that I got outside and did about a 20-minute walk just to get some natural daylight through my eyes to help with that resetting of my circadian rhythm. And if you want to know how obsessive I am about that sort of light and exercise equation for my sleep, when I was back in Berkeley, I used to go to the university gym, but I would see my students there all of the time. So I started taking out my contact lenses so I couldn't make eye contact, so I couldn't recognize anyone. And then I was thinking, what am I doing? And then the second thing is that no one wants to see their professor in Lycra. So I thought, okay, take yourself to a different gym. But when I was shopping around different gyms, because I would work out in the mornings, I would always do the sort of the spin bike to do my cardio in the morning. I found a gym that would face eastward, that had large glass with the spin bikes in front of them. This is how, this is why I have no social life. And that way, in the morning, I could combine both my daylight exposure and my exercise. Now, granted, there is some degree of light lux deficit by way of having that window, but it's still a degree of natural daylight coming into my retina to help regulate my rhythms. So I tried to step and repeat some of that today. But more generally, what can you do if you're traveling through multiple time zones? I would probably say that there are two strategic buckets that you can think in. The first is what you should do during the flight. The second is what you should do when you've arrived in the new time zone. So if I give you the example, I'm flying from California all the way back home to London. So London is 8 hours ahead. So I'm already 8 hours trying to play catch up. As soon as I get onto the plane, before I do anything else, the first thing I do is I open my phone, I open my laptop, and I change all of the clock faces, all of the time, to the time in the new time zone. And that way, as soon as I look at my watch, let's say that I get on the flight at 8 p.m. in the evening in San Francisco, London's 8 hours ahead. So I look at my watch and I realize, oh my goodness, it's already 4 a.m. in the morning. So I know instantly that helps reset everything. I now know that I need to eat as soon as possible and start sleeping, because everyone on that transatlantic flight will be sleeping at the wrong time. They will wait until their natural bedtime, So they will be going to bed, you know, after 3 or 4 hours on the 11-hour flight. And then they'll be waking up just as we're coming into London at around 11 a.m. or midday. Well, that's a disaster, because then when it comes to that subsequent night, when they're in London for the first night, they're going to try and get into bed at a reasonable time when everyone else is getting into bed, 11 p.m. or midnight. But they've only been awake for maybe 11 hours or 12 hours. That's not enough time to build up this sleepiness chemical called adenosine to help weigh you down with sleepiness so that you feel sleepy. So what happens, you just lie in bed awake and you can't fall asleep. So I will try and sleep early in the flight. So don't worry about the London example. My suggestion to you would be, look at the time in the new time zone and try and count back at least 12 hours of time from when you are going to go to bed in the new time zone, no matter what your flight. And then at that point, you know 12 hours before you need to get into bed or want to get into bed in the new time zone when you arrive is when you should be waking up on the flight, which then tells you what time you need to be trying to tuck yourself into bed and try and get some sleep. So that's the first thing, change all the clock faces and then estimate time for sleep onset. The next thing, stay away from alcohol and caffeine on the flight. I know they are served freely and liberally, but both of them will disrupt your ability to regulate your circadian rhythm. It's also not going to really help you with sleep. And we'll come on to perhaps, please ask me about alcohol and caffeine, or maybe I'll come on to them in terms of sleep tips in a little while. Then when you're in the new time zone, several suggestions. As I said, firstly, try and get exercise sometime during the morning. Try to get some daylight exposure. And then the final thing is try to eat at the same time when everyone else is eating in the new time zone, because that food will act almost as powerfully as light and exercise, like a set of fingers on your wristwatch in terms of the food sort of signal helping you reset your circadian rhythm. Finally, have some expectation management. Based on the data, you can adjust about 1 hour for every day you're in a new time zone. So if I fly to London and it's 8 hours ahead, it's going to take me about 8 days before I start to feel normal. Now, with some of these tips and tricks, you can try to fast forward that a little bit. But I'm usually staying there for about a week. So just as I've started to acclimate to UK time, I then usually fly back home to the West Coast. So I'm no poster child. Does that help in terms of some sort of jet-like circadian rhythm tips?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's really great. And bringing up the circadian rhythms makes me want to recognize Dr. Joe Takahashi, who won the Nobel Prize for Circadian Rhythms, who's with us tonight, and his wife, Carla Green, that does amazing research. And we're so fortunate for them to be here and to think about how we might do our projects together. So
Could you both stand up?
please
And
stand up.
Please,
Please stand up.
just for me, these are absolute legends in the field.
Yeah.
I actually felt remarkably stupid answering that question when we've got these two people in the room who've done the seminal work. I mean, it is, when you talk about sort of, you know, godmothers and godfathers of fields, circadian rhythm here.
Yeah, so we're
Thank you for what you've both
even
done.
a double amazing night because of that. Thank you. So I'd like to ask the audience right now to have a show of hands. How many of you typically get 6 hours or less of sleep a night?
And it's okay, it's a safe place here. You can tell me.
We won't report.
Give me all of your addresses. I'm coming to do an intervention in the next, no.
So about a third, don't you think, of
Yeah.
people? But the rest of you weren't honest, because I know it's really 80% of you.
Yeah, if you look at the data, almost 1 out of every 2 people that you pass on the street in America are trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less during the week, which is stunning. And by the way, I should say that based on the studies, the number of people who can survive on 6 hours of sleep or less without showing any impairment in their brain or their body, rounded to a whole number and expressed as a percent of the population, is 0.
So what happens to our health when we routinely get less than 6 hours of sleep? What is the impact on our health?
In truth, there is no major physiological system in your body or operation of your mind that isn't wonderfully enhanced when you get sleep or demonstrably impaired when you don't get enough. And let me just sort of give you a few examples, perhaps downstairs in the body, because I think we're going to speak about the brain in much more detail. I could firstly tell you that after 1 week of short sleep, if I were to limit you to, let's say, 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night, your blood sugar levels would be so disrupted that your doctor would classify you as being pre-diabetic. Or I could tell you that healthy young males who are sleeping just 5 or 6 hours a night will have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior. So in other words, a lack of sleep will age a man by almost a decade in terms of that critical aspect of wellness and virility. And I should note that we see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health caused by a lack of sleep, both estrogen, luteinizing hormone, and also follicle stimulating hormone. Or I could tell you that after just one night, and we've done some of these studies, where we limit you to just 4 hours of sleep for one night, we see a 70% drop in critical anti-cancer fighting immune cells called natural killer cells. That is quite an alarming state of immune deficiency, and it happens after just one bad night of sleep. And that link between a lack of sleep and cancer and disrupted sleep-wake rhythms is now so strong that recently the World Health Organization decided to classify any form of nighttime shift work as a probable carcinogen. In fact, they've now repeated this affirmation. It actually came some years ago, and they re-looked at the data, and they just reaffirmed that same World Health, and it has a A2C classification. I'm not going to bore you with that, but a probable carcinogen because of a disruption of your sleep-wake rhythms. Now, it doesn't take that amount of a lack of sleep to cause harm. All it takes is 1 hour. And here I'll tell you about sleep loss in your cardiovascular system, because there is a global experiment that is performed on 1.6 billion people across 75 countries twice a year. And it's called daylight savings time. Now, in the spring, when we lose just 1 hour of sleep opportunity, we've observed a 24% relative increase in heart attacks the following day. Now, in the fall, in the autumn, when you gain an hour of sleep, there is a 21% reduction in heart attacks. So it's bidirectional. And by the way, we see equivalent changes and relationships in terms of road traffic accidents on our streets, even suicide rates. In fact, one of the most recent studies that just blew my mind, they were looking at the sentencing of federal judges. And what they found is that if you were sentenced in the week or the several days after that spring change, those judges dished out far harsher sentences as a result because they were in a bad mood, because of a disruption of their sleep. And we know sleep is so intimately tied to your mood and your emotional health.
Yikes.
So if you commit a federal crime, absolutely, go for your sentencing somewhere around the fall time change with an hour of sleep addition. So I will stop there. Hopefully that gives you just kind of like a finger buffet of some of the associations.
I think I get an idea of where you are on daylight saving time shifting. Sounds like it, yes.
Very much so.
Oh, man.
I know.
So, we think about our genes as being set and fixed, but you said that quality of sleep can even affect the activity of our genes. How and why does our sleep affect our genes?
You would,
I don't mean blue jeans.
No, we're not talking about the sort of the company in terms of denim. So there's some really fascinating evidence now. firstly, what we started to see is that the structure of your sort of chromosomes, and they will have this little protective cap on them called a telomere, and often the analogy is it's a little bit like a shoelace cap, and it stops sort of your DNA starting to fray, and the older that we get, unfortunately, the more disrupted and the more eroded that cap is on your genetic material, these telomeres, as it were. And what we firstly started to discover is that people who were reporting short sleep had more damage to their telomeres. In other words, the sort of structural DNA looked more aged as a consequence. So in other words, from a DNA perspective, your physiological age was not matching your chronological age. Your physiological age was showing that you were much older than your chronological age was, related to that sleep disruption. But then I think one of the most powerful studies was done out of the UK, and it came from the University of Surrey. And they took a group of perfectly healthy individuals and they limited them to sleeping 6 hours a night for 1 week. And then they measured the change in their gene activity profile relative to those same individuals when they were getting a full 8 hours of sleep every night for that 1 week. And there were essentially 2 key findings. The first was that a sizable and significant 711 genes were distorted in their activity caused by that 1 week of short sleep. And as I said, by the way, that this is highly applicable to society. We know that many people are trying to get by on 6 hours, so it is relevant. The second finding was that about half of those genes were actually increased in their activity. The other half were decreased. Now, those genes that were increased or ramped up, or what we call overexpressed, caused by a lack of sleep, were genes that were associated with the immune system. So, sorry, that's genes that were switched off, sorry. So, in other words, once again, you could see at a genetic level, this immune compromised state. You could even see it in the genetic readout. Those genes that were increased in their activity were genes that were related to long-term chronic stress and inflammation within the body, genes that were associated with the promotion of tumors, and genes that were associated with cardiovascular disease. And what that study essentially taught us was that there is no aspect of your physical wellness that can retreat at the sign of sleep deprivation and get away unscathed. And it's almost like a broken water pipe in your home. That sleep loss will leak down into every nook and cranny of your physiology, and it will even tamper with the very DNA nucleic alphabet that spells out your daily health narrative. I just found that stunning.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But can you get too much sleep? You know, you think about, because now don't you want to have a cot right now and go to sleep?
Yeah.
Start with your DNA to get restored. So, but can you get too much sleep?
So it's a very good question, and we have something that we observe in the literature called hypersomnia, which is a condition, hyper meaning excessive, somnia obviously meaning sleep. But if you look at that data, it's largely in individuals who are suffering from major depression. And if you dig a little bit further into those studies, what you see is that the way they asked those individuals about their sleep was perhaps a little bit misleading. They were saying, what time did you get into bed and what time did you get out of bed, as a proxy for how much sleep that they were getting. Now, the problem with that, with depression, is that when you are depressed, you suffer from what's called anhedonia, which is that you get less pleasure from normally pleasurable experiences. And many people with depression, when they don't want to face the world, what do? Well, they just stay in bed. And so it could be them just staying in bed that is masquerading as if it's long sleep, that is perhaps bad and associated with major mental health conditions. That's one issue. The other second finding is that if you look at the relationship between sleep and your lifespan, if you use the sweet spot of our recommendation right now for the average adult, which is somewhere between 7 to 9 hours is the recommendation for all adults. Using that sweet spot, you can give a very simple truth, that from that range, the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. Short sleep predicts all-cause mortality. But something interesting happens when you look in the opposite direction. Once you get past 9 hours of sleep, it's not as though your mortality risk continues to go down the more and more that you sleep. It baselines out, then it starts to hook back up. So it's almost like a reverse J shape, sort of slightly tilted on its side, as if sleeping longer leads to a premature death once you get past 9 hours. Well, if you dig into those data a little bit, something interesting appears. Firstly, those people who are typically reporting sleeping longer than 9 hours are people who have poor quality of sleep. So they have really bad quality of sleep. So what happens? Well, they stay in bed longer and they try to sleep back some of the sleep that they're not getting because their sleep is so fragmented and they're awake so much of the night. And we know that poor quality of sleep is now just as important as poor quantity of sleep for your health. So that's the first explanation. The second explanation is that if you look at those studies again, what we think was happening is that when you get sick, when you've got, the flu or whatever it is, typically what do you want to do? You want to just curl up and go to bed. And that's a very proven link that infection and ill health will stimulate a set of pathways largely augmented through your immune system that will ramp up your sleep generating mechanisms and it will have you sleeping more. So your body knows that you're under attack and it calls up the very best Swiss Army knife that you could ever imagine, which is this thing called more sleep. And so what was happening is that in those people who were getting very sick, they were sleeping more, they were sleeping increased amounts to try and help with their sickness. But whatever sickness that they had, let's say it's some form of terminal cancer, it was just too much for sleep to combat. And therefore they still died prematurely. But they were trying to sleep in response to that. And so it artificially looks like longer sleep leads to a premature death, if that makes some kind of sense. But let me finally play devil's advocate. Could there be such a thing as too much sleep? It may sound strange coming from me, but I think there actually could be, yes. But make no mistake about it, that is no different than the 3 other critical ingredients of life: food, oxygen, and water. Can you undereat? Yes. Can you overeat? Yes, you can. Can you drink too little water? Of course, you can get dehydrated, but you can overhydrate. It happened in the 1990s with the ecstasy craze, where people were going to dance clubs. Governments got very worried about them in terms of overheating. They said drink as much water as you could. People drank too much fluid, they diluted their electrolytes, and they started to have either heart attacks or they had cerebral brain swelling and they went into a coma. So you can have too much water. Can you have too much oxygen? Yes, it's called hyperoxemia, and it's damaging, it's toxic to brain cells. So the 4th other major ingredient of life, which is sleep, could that also obey that same U-shaped function law? I think it could be. Have we found any mechanism yet that too much sleep is harmful for your health? We haven't, in truth. And also, are most people in danger of getting too much sleep? Au contraire.
The opposite. I'm going to ask him one more question, then we're going to open up to the audience. First, the people here, and then virtually. So be thinking of what you're dying to ask, Dr. Walker. But I wanted to ask, so as we're talking about sleep, doesn't it make you wonder, do I have good sleep? Do I have bad sleep? Do people, as they start to monitor their sleep, talk about it? What happens if you get too worried about your sleep, that you're wearing these things and it said you didn't have a good night's sleep? I know I was part of a sleep study, and the second night it said you have terrible sleep, and I said I'm not doing this anymore because I'm sleeping great, and it's telling me I'm not, and I don't believe it. But does it make people sleep better or sleep worse when they're monitoring?
For the most part, people sleep better when they're monitoring it. So I've got this ring, this sort of smart ring. It's called an Oura Ring, and there's lots of other devices too. For the most part, people start doing a little better with their sleep when they buy these devices. And in medicine, often what we say is what gets measured gets managed. And it's especially true for sleep, because I can ask you, how was your workout today? Or, how was your eating? Did you eat healthy? Did you not eat healthy? But if I were to ask you, what was the quantity of your deep non-REM sleep? What was the amount of REM sleep that you had? You have no conscious sense of that. Also, second, if I were to ask you, you come through into the kitchen in the morning, you say, darling, how did you sleep last night? Most people can tell you, I slept well or I didn't sleep well. But if I were to ask you, how did you sleep last Tuesday? You don't remember, nor do I. But with a historical record, you can start to see trends in your data, and you can start to match that with what's going on in your life. When you're going through significant stress, I can see that there was a period where I went through that, and I could see my heart rate variability really change, my heart rate changed, my sleep efficiency started to change. It was self-evident in the data, and it was only because I could see that trend across this sort of 6-week period. It was striking. I wouldn't have known that otherwise. There is a subset of people for whom, however, they get worried and it makes matters worse. If you're struggling with sleep, then opening up an app every morning that just reinforces to you, yes, you had another bad night of sleep, is not helpful. And in fact, it now has a clinical disorder. It's called orthosomnia. Now, you've heard of ortho before in medicine, orthopedics, orthodontics. The word ortho means get straight. Orthopedics means getting your bones straight. Orthodontics, getting your teeth straight. Orthosomnia is worry about getting your sleep straight. And it becomes so damaging that people get anxious. And at that point, I tell them one of two pieces of advice. First, if it's really bad, just take the ring off or the tracking. Just forget, put it away, take a vacation from it. It's not going to help you. The other is, keep wearing it, but don't check every day. Only check at the end of every week. And that way you're not myopically focused every day. I realize that we haven't spoken about sleep and Alzheimer's disease, which is...
We're going to get there, but
okay.
I want to open up to it. Yes, we're going to get to sleep and Alzheimer's.
Yes, someone please,
sleep in the
planting a
workplace.
question about sleep and Alzheimer's
Steve,
disease.
it's time for question. Oh, Caitlin's doing it. So we're going to open it up if you have some questions that you would like to ask. Identify yourself and ask away.
I'll try and be much quicker.
Thank you, Sandy. Excuse me. Doctor, this is wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I could ask a dozen questions about dreams, but just using that as open door to some discussion on what you think dreams do to our sleep habits and how we can change that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. We've long known, so dreams, as most of us think of them, come from a particular stage of sleep, which is called rapid eye movement sleep. The other main type of sleep that you have is called non-rapid eye movement sleep. Now, technically, depending on how you define a dream, you dream in many stages of sleep. But the things that most of us call dreams, these hallucinogenic, these bizarre, these sort of memory-laden, these autobiographical experiences, these are the things that come from rapid eye movement sleep. And we had discovered, we being the royal we discovered lots of different functions of this thing called REM sleep, but that doesn't really tell you if there is any function of dreams above and beyond the stage from which they come, which is this thing called rapid eye movement sleep. So a good example would be a light bulb. The reason that you create a light bulb is to produce this thing called light. And that would be REM sleep. The reason that the brain constructs this neural apparatus and circuitry that it does is to produce this thing called REM sleep. But it turns out that when you produce light in that way, you also produce this thing called heat. It's just the epiphenomenon of what happens when you create light in this way. It's not the function of the light bulb. And for a while, we thought that dreams were just the epiphenomenal heat of this thing called REM sleep, that dreams had no functional benefit at all. They were just epiphenomenal, just like the redness of your blood. It serves no function. But then we started to discover quite the opposite, that above and beyond REM sleep itself, dreams serve now at least two different benefits. The first is creativity and association. During dream sleep, it's almost like informational alchemy, that your brain during dream sleep takes all that you've been learning recently and starts colliding and fusing it together with everything, all of your back catalog of information. So you wake up the next day with a revised mind-wide web of associations that is capable of divining novel solutions to previously impenetrable problems. And it's the reason that you will never have been told to stay awake on a problem. That's the first benefit of dreams that we've discovered. So creativity. The second is that dreams seem to provide a form of overnight therapy. Dreaming provides a form of emotional first aid. And we and others have done these studies. We've done a lot of work in this. Dreaming acts almost like a nocturnal soothing balm. And I can bore you as to why this works for the neurochemistry of dreaming and the physiology of dreaming. But it is like a nocturnal soothing balm in that it comes along and takes those difficult experiences that you've been having and just sort of takes the sharp edges off those emotional experiences so that you wake up the next day and you feel better about those experiences. So it's not time that heals all wounds. It's time during sleep, and specifically dreaming, that provides that form of emotional convalescence. And there's a great American entrepreneur, I love his phrase, who summarized basically the past 15 years of work that I've done in this area. And it was a guy called E. Joseph Kosman, and he said the following: the best bridge between despair and hope is a good night of sleep. That's dreaming.
Very good. Oh, wait, just.
Yes, sorry. I think the question was, how do I combat insomnia?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't provide you with, obviously, medical advice. But what I would say is, firstly, classic sleeping pills do not seem to be the answer. Now, they may, and when I say classic sleeping pills, I won't name names, but you can name all of the typical sleeping pills. They do have their place for short-term treatment of sleep problems in an acute phase. Let's say it's bereavement, or someone's lost their job, or they've gone through a very painful divorce. But they are not recommended for long-term treatment. But most people are using them long-term. In fact, in 2016, the American College of Physicians made a landmark recommendation. They said that based on the safety risks and the concerns regarding sleeping pills, they must no longer be the first-line recommended treatment for insomnia. Never again. Instead, it must be something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI for short. And what's interesting about CBTI is that you work with a psychologist or a clinician. It's usually about 8 sessions, each an hour. And not only is CBTI just as effective as sleeping pills in the short term for combating insomnia, but unlike sleeping pills, when you stop sleeping pills, not only do you go back to the bad sleep that you were having, often you suffer a horrific insomnia rebound, this sort of really bad sleep. And then what does that lead to? Leads to you remitting and then jumping back on the sleeping pills again. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is just as effective as sleeping pills in the short term. But what's good is that when you stop working with the clinician and the therapist, those benefits continue to last because you're given a toolbox for how to solve your sleep. And those benefits last 6 months later, 1 year later, 2 years later, and the most recent study was 5 years later. Now, it doesn't work for everyone, and the key is getting someone who's trained properly in this. There's a lot of people out there sort of hand-waving saying, you know, I'm a health coach and I can coach your sleep. Nonsense. Look at someone who's accredited by behavioral sleep medicine, who has accreditation for cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Only use them. There was one other thing I was going to say about CBTI, and it's now departed from my memory. But those would be the suggestions for you. Also, try to stay away from alcohol. Try to stay away from THC. Many people will use that as a sleep assistant aid, and I'm happy to go into detail as to why. but those things are usually not helping your insomnia, they're hurting your insomnia. And by the way, what CBTI does is the following. When you're suffering from insomnia, your sleep controls you. You don't control your sleep. And when you go into the bedroom every night, and by the way, I'm no poster child for good sleep. I've had at least 2 bouts of insomnia in my lifetime. So I know the pain. And what happens is that every night when I would, go into the bedroom, I'd lost all confidence in my ability to sleep. And what CBTI does, it gives you back your confidence. So now, rather than your sleep controlling you, you control your sleep.
That's good. That's really good.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I've been reading Why We Sleep, and I've been going around telling everybody I know about it and having conversations with everybody. I had a colleague that I specifically spoke about the link between lack of REM sleep and autism that you talked about in the book. And she specifically was asking, she has a child who has autism, is there anything that can be done to increase REM sleep or any therapies that are out there that can help to at least improve some of those symptoms?
So right now, the data in the book, and it hasn't changed too much, is really just associational, that those changes that we see are between REM sleep and sleep in general, but REM sleep included, and autism. Right now, we don't know if they're causal. So that's the sort of the first thing to keep in mind. But let's assume that one day the evidence suggests that it is causal. REM sleep is actually much more difficult to change than deep non-REM sleep. I can improve your deep non-REM sleep with things such as exercise, with things such as temperature, somewhat a little bit with diet, but diet is actually, it seems to be quite stubborn in terms of its modulation of sleep. REM sleep has been proven much more difficult to augment. One of the best methods that we have right now is temperature, though. So the temperature equation for good sleep is that you need to warm up to cool down to fall asleep, and then you need to stay cool to stay asleep, and then you need to warm up to wake up. And so with some of these smart mattresses now, that's what we've been able to do. We can imprint a thermal signature and see if we can take you through that optimal change. Whereas most people set 70 degrees on the thermostat when it should actually be set at 65 degrees for better sleep. So the reason I mentioned temperature, though, is that by warming people up, we can actually potentially increase REM sleep. The goal is to try and not warm you beyond your sort of thermoneutral set point, but we need to try and get you the ambient temperature closer to your neutral sort of temperature set point. That seems to then increase the amount of REM sleep. So right now, I would say we don't have good methods.
Are you wanting to do online now? One more here? Okay. Here.
Oh, thank you both for being here and all the work that you have done, and thanks KERA.
I don't think the microphone is on. Oh, now it's on.
I would like to hear, I know you've written about the power nap. I don't know what you're calling it in here, but I haven't read this yet, but I'm going to. Could you please speak to the power nap?
Yeah, so naps, we've done a lot of work with naps, and I would say naps are actually a double-edged sword. Now, to explain this a little bit better, the reason that if you are struggling with sleep at night, the advice is do not nap during the day. Even if you've had a bad night of sleep, resist the urge to nap. In fact, if you've had a bad night of sleep, the best advice I have for you is the following. Do nothing. What I mean by that is don't wake up any later to compensate for that bad night of sleep. Wake up at your standard time, because if you wake up later, then when it comes time to your normal bedtime the next evening, you're not going to be as sleepy anymore because you woke up much later. So don't wake up any later. That following night, don't go to bed any earlier thinking, well, I had a bad night of sleep, so I'm going to get myself into bed earlier. Because your circadian rhythm is expecting you to be going to bed at your natural time. But if you go to bed an hour earlier, you're just going to be lying in bed wide awake, and yet it's another bad night. So you've set yourself up for that. Don't overcompensate with caffeine. And finally, don't nap. And the reason is the following. From the moment everyone here woke up this morning, a chemical has been building up in your brain. That chemical is called adenosine. And the more of that adenosine that builds up, the sleepier that you feel. It's the sleepiness chemical. And then when we sleep, the brain gets the chance to essentially remove that adenosine. And if you look at the sort of equation, it basically takes about 8 hours of sleep to clear out about 16 hours of the accumulation of all of that sleepiness, that sleep pressure, that adenosine. Why is this related to naps? Well, it's related to naps because if you nap during the day, it's almost like a pressure valve on a cooker. You'll just release some of that healthy sleepiness. And so when it comes time for you to fall asleep in the evening, you no longer feel as sleepy. You don't have that same weight of sleepiness weighing you down. So you either don't fall asleep as easily, or you fall asleep, but you can't stay asleep as easily. So the advice is, if you're struggling with sleep at night, don't nap during the day. But if you are not struggling with sleep at night, and you can nap regularly during the day, then naps are wonderful. We've done lots of studies. Brain and body, they provide benefits. 2 caveats. First, keep them short. Try not to go longer than 25 minutes. Otherwise, you start going into the deeper phases of sleep, and when you wake up out of a deeper phase of sleep, you feel miserable. It's almost like a hangover effect. It's called sleep inertia. And you feel almost worse for the first hour than you did before the nap. The second is don't nap, probably rule of thumb, much later than about 3 p.m. because napping in the late afternoon or in the early evening is a little bit like snacking before your main meal. It just takes the appetite, the edge off your sleep hunger. So that would be the advice.
Awesome. Now we also have some great questions from the virtual audience. And the first one relates to, are there markers of a better sleeping brain? Can you track changes that happen in the brain? And maybe this leads to the Alzheimer's discussion. Are there things that happen that you can track that show your brain is sleeping better or is more apt to sleep better?
So we don't have particularly good measures right now to demonstrate that over time, improvements in your brain are a proxy for improvements in sleep, or vice versa, that as you improve your sleep, these aspects of your brain health improve. And in fact, it's a collaboration that we spent about an hour just discussing before this evening, and we're really excited to be working together. So this is something that we're going to be able to answer. But it does come on to the, if I flip that coin around, which is what happens when you're sleeping insufficiently or your sleep is of poor quality, what measures in the brain show deleterious damage. And here, the work on Alzheimer's disease is critical. I think it's probably some of the most exciting work in the past 5 years in the field of sleep science. And firstly, what we discovered is that people who are sleeping 6 hours or less had a significantly higher risk of going on to develop Alzheimer's disease later in life. The second is that people with insomnia or untreated sleep apnea, which is heavy snoring, they also had a markedly increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. The problem with those three is that they're associational. That's just correlation. That doesn't prove causation. So correlation then went in search of causation. And we and others have done the human studies, and the animal studies have also now been done. If you take a human being and you deprive them either of sleep for just one night, or you selectively deprive them of just deep sleep for one night, the next day we can see an immediate increase in the amount of Alzheimer's disease protein. This is amyloid protein and tau protein, the sort of these sticky toxic proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. We can see an immediate increase the next day after one night of insufficient sleep, either circulating in your bloodstream, circulating in your cerebrospinal fluid, or directly using special brain scans in your brain itself. So that was a causal demonstration, no longer correlation, which then led to the question, well, if a lack of sleep will increase your Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain and your Alzheimer's disease risk, which, by the way, explained the epidemiological study, that if you're not getting sleep, well, let me come back to that. Let me explain the third part. If a lack of sleep increases your Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain and Alzheimer's disease risk, then flip that logic around. What is it about sleep when you do get it that de-risks your Alzheimer's disease probability? And this was a study done by a scientist. It was a remarkable discovery, a scientist called Macon Nedegard at the University of Rochester. And studying mice, what she found, firstly, is that your brain has a sewage system. And we never used to think that the brain had a sewage system. Now, you all know of your body having one. It's called the lymphatic system. But we didn't think your brain had one. Well, it does. It's called the glymphatic system, named after the cells that make it up in your brain called the glial cells. If that wasn't remarkable enough, she made 2 more discoveries. The first is that that sewage system in the brain isn't always switched on in high flow volume during the 24-hour period. It was only when you sleep that that sewage system kicked into high gear. So in other words, it's good night, sleep clean. That sleep is a power cleanse for your brain. The final part then she discovered, which brings it back around to Alzheimer's disease, was that 2 of the pieces of metabolic detritus that this sleep cleansing system was washing away every night was beta amyloid and tau protein, both related to Alzheimer's disease. Now we understood the epidemiological data. If you're not getting sufficient sleep every night, you're not getting that cleansing of the brain, and it becomes like compounding interest on a loan. Night after night, you're not clearing that Alzheimer's protein, set of proteins, and it just builds up and builds up. Now, it's going to take years before it starts to have an effect, but it will have an effect. And what's exciting now about this is that people here are doing remarkable work where we're actually starting to find ways that we can intervene in brain health, even in late stages of life. But right now, modern medicine doesn't have any good wholesale approaches for treating Alzheimer's disease. But that sleep is a missing piece in the explanatory puzzle of aging and Alzheimer's disease is exciting because sleep is a modifiable factor. What if we could start augmenting human sleep in midlife, when that great decline in deep sleep starts to begin? Could I start to, by doing that, and we've developed some electrical brain stimulation technology to do this, could I actually start to bend the arrow of Alzheimer's disease risk down on itself and shift from a model of late stage treatment to a model of midlife prevention? That's one of our moonshot goals now.
Yeah, Matt, I want to add to something that you just said, that we had done a study, a randomized trial with Alzheimer's, people with MCI, and healthy people, where we did 7 Tesla looking at brain energy metabolism changes and improving their sleep using a dental device, which is, different.
Yep.
And we found that the people in this kind of at-risk category, they actually, when their sleep got better, their brain energy metabolism got better, and their cognition improved back to normals. So it's exactly what you're saying, is you improve someone's sleep, they moved from the MCI to the normal category. So I'm totally on page.
Just to sort of double click on that, firstly, it's a remarkable study. And what it tells you is that it's never too late to start sleeping better. Even if you're in your 60s or your 70s and you think, well, I haven't slept well all my life, I've been short sleeping, I'm a lost cause, I'm just going to give up. There's no need to be fatalistic. And it reminds me of a study that we collaborated with some folks at UCSF a while ago. And these people had sleep apnea, heavy snoring, and it's part of this jaw mandibulary sort of, you put this dental device in. But about half of the individuals, so everyone got sleep apnea device, this sort of thing that you wear on your face. And about half of them complied to the treatment, the other didn't. And then we tracked them almost for 15 years. And what we found was that those people who adhered to the sleep device and whose sleep improved, they staved off the onslaught of Alzheimer's disease by about 10 years relative to those individuals who didn't comply to the treatment. So once again, that's a causal manipulation. And that tells you again, it's never too late. These were people in past the foothills of middle age.
So Matt, I may be preaching to the choir here, but I've combined like 3 questions, and they come from...
I'll be quick now, sorry.
The folks who work in healthcare, warriors, elite performers, and elite athletes.
Yep.
part of their training is sleep deprivation and getting used to sleep deprivation. Yeah. And then they're in the real world when they're actually sleep deprived. What do you counsel those folks are? And are we really having to go back to the well and culturally change how we train all of these elite performers? Because I think we've kind of left them out to dry, but I thought these questions were right on point from many different fields.
So we've worked with a lot of athletes in our time, and the first thing is that this mentality of, you train until into the evening, and then your coach has you awake, your Olympic coach has you awake at 5 a.m. back on the track or whatever it is absolute nonsense. That sleep is probably the greatest legal performance enhancing drug that most people are not abusing enough. If you look at the data, and that data is very clear. Also, this notion, and we've seen it in the workplace, and we see it particularly in the military and in medicine, is this almost, I think of it, and I don't mean to be dismissive, but it's almost this sleep machismo attitude. And it is an old boys network, if you look at the trickle down, which is that, well, it's a hazing. We went through it, so you have to go through it. And that data is now very clear in medicine, for example. And I can rattle off all of the statistics. We know, for example, that young residents working in the intensive care unit, they will inflict almost 400% more diagnostic errors when they've worked a 30-hour shift relative to when they've worked a 16-hour shift. We know that a surgeon who has slept less than 6 hours in the past 24 is 170% more likely to cause a major surgical error, such as severing a vein or leaving an implement in you if they've been underslept. And worse still, when those young doctors who we are inflicting with this mindless assault of a lack of sleep get back into their car after working a 30-hour shift following being in the ER, and they drive home, they are 168% more likely to get into a road traffic accident, ending back up in the emergency room from where they just came, but now as a patient. And we see this in education, and we see this in the military. And just to put this in context, this idea that I can train myself to overcome a lack of sleep within, a year of training or being 20 years on the job is just hubris. Because it took Mother Nature about 3.6 million years to put this essential need of 7 to 9 hours of sleep in place. And then we come along and we think within the space of 30 years that we can somehow train ourselves out of that. When you fight biology, you normally lose. And when you lose, the way you know you've lost is disease and sickness.
It's awesome. One more from the audience, then I think Sandy has a question. Many of our audience asked, is melatonin a good thing?
I mean, I feel like I should pass this question to Joe. I can speak a little bit about it. Melatonin is a hormone that's released from a gland, the back area of your brain. It is sometimes called the hormone of darkness. It's also called the vampire hormone, not because it makes you look longingly at people's necklines and want to bite in. It's because the hormone comes out during darkness. It comes out at night. And melatonin helps with the timing of your sleep schedule. But melatonin doesn't seem to be particularly effective in terms of improving sleep. In fact, there was a meta-analysis done, a meta-analysis where you gather together all of the individual studies and you put them in a big statistical bucket and you say, what's the big picture here? And what they found was that melatonin only improves the speed with which you fall asleep by about 3.9 minutes, which relative to placebo is not much. And it only improved your sleep efficiency by about 2.2%. Why is this? Think of melatonin almost like the starting official at the 100-meter race in the Olympics. Melatonin is the starting official with the gun that begins the great sleep race, but the starting official doesn't participate in the race itself. That's a whole different set of sleep chemicals. And that's why melatonin doesn't seem to be a particularly helpful sleep aid. Now, if you look at the data, I think it actually does work for some people, a subset of people. For the other people, I would say that the placebo effect is the most reliable effect in all of pharmacology. So if it's working for you, maybe no harm, no foul, with two big exceptions. Firstly, melatonin here in the United States is not regulated by the FDA. It's deemed as a supplement. Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem for the second reason. A study looked at 20 different brands of melatonin. Based on what they said was in the tablet, relative to what was actually in the tablet itself, it ranged from being 80% less than what it stated on the bottle to being 460% more than what was on the bottle. And by the way, go down the aisle at the grocery store and you will see now a slew of pediatric gummies taking whopping what we call supraphysiological doses of melatonin that far exceed anything that your body would normally release. And now it's commonplace for parents with kids who are struggling with sleep just to give them melatonin gummies. And I just recently went to the FDA and with a Yale pediatrician to try to appeal for tighter control because it's getting a little bit out of control.
Wow.
Sandy, did you have one more question? Then I have one more from the audience as we close.
Well, I wanted to close with mine.
Okay.
Because we've got 3 minutes. Because what amazing, amazing talk. But don't you all want to know, so, okay, I'm scared, I've got to sleep, but should I start now? What 3 things would you love every single person here to go away with to make sure they do for their sleep? If you were to say the top 3, where you're in the workplace or our teenagers and young adults that are bulimic sleepers where they don't sleep during the week but try to catch up and, you know, everything. So what 3 things would you want everyone here to be, I'm going to take home and I'm going to talk about and make sure I do?
Okay, I think probably the 3 maybe most impactful things that you could think about is, the first is regularity. If I could give you one piece of advice to try to keep your sleep straight, it's regularity. Go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time. No matter whether it's the weekday or the weekend, regularity is king. And by the way, I don't usually like giving, rules to people because people don't respond to rules. People respond to reasons, not rules. So I'll try and explain each one. The reason is in part because of the 2 people we've got sitting in front of us here and the knowledge that we've got, that your circadian rhythm, this 24-hour clock in your brain, expects regularity and thrives best under conditions of regularity, including regulating your wake-sleep schedule. So that's the first thing. Regularity is king. And also making sure that you're getting the right sleep opportunity to get your 7 to 9 hours. The second thing is be mindful of alcohol. I know, I'm a desperately unpopular person based on personality, but when I tell you about these 2 things, which are the last 2 things, which is alcohol and caffeine, it makes me even more unpopular. I basically have the personality that's like the best prophylactic known to human nature. So here's the following. When it comes to alcohol, it is not going to help your sleep. Many people will have a couple of glasses of wine in the evening, a few nightcaps, and they say, it really helps me sleep. Unfortunately, that's nonsense. Alcohol, and let me give you the reasons. Alcohol is in a class of drugs that we call the sedatives. And sedation is not sleep. But when you have a couple of glasses of alcohol in the evening, you mistake the former for the latter. And in fact, if I were to show you the electrical signature of your sleep with alcohol on board versus when you're sober, it's not the same. You would see that it's different. Sedation is not sleep. The second problem with alcohol is that it fragments your sleep. So you're going to wake up many more times throughout the night, and that's bad quality of sleep. The problem is that many of those awakenings are so brief that you never commit them to memory. So you wake up the next morning, you don't feel refreshed or restored, but you don't remember having a hard time falling asleep because you were knocked out by the alcohol sedating your cortex, and you don't remember the awakening, so you don't put 2 and 2 together. The third issue with alcohol is that it is one of the most potent suppressors of REM sleep that we know. And we've spoken all about the benefits of REM sleep. So that's the second thing. The third thing is caffeine. Caffeine there are 3 things with caffeine too that may surprise you. The first is its duration of action. Caffeine has what we call a half-life of about 5 to 6 hours. In other words, after about 5 to 6 hours, 50% of that caffeine is still in your system, which means that caffeine has a quarter life of 10 to 12 hours. In other words, if you have a cup of coffee at noon, a quarter of that caffeine is still swirling around in your brain at midnight. So if you have a cup of coffee at noon, it's a little bit like getting into bed at midnight, and before you turn the light out, you swig a quarter of a cup of Starbucks and you hope for a good night of sleep. And it's probably not going to happen. The second issue with caffeine, is, of course, is that it makes it harder for you to fall asleep. And also, caffeine is what we call an anxiogenic. Caffeine will increase your anxiety. Now, if you're struggling to then fall asleep because of the caffeine, what's worse is that the caffeine then creates what I call this Rolodex of anxiety, where you're lying in bed and all of a sudden you start thinking. You start thinking about what didn't I do, what do I need to do? You start ruminating. And when you start ruminating, you start catastrophizing. And after you start catastrophizing, when your head is on the pillow, you're dead in the water for the next 2 hours. So that's the second problem with caffeine. The final problem with caffeine is that some people will say, look, I'm one of those individuals, and there is genetic variability in your ability to clear caffeine from the system, and we know the genes. You can do a genetic test. The 2 genes that you want to look out for are genes called, one of the ones that you want to look out for mostly is something called the CYP1A2 gene. Alphabet spaghetti, it means nothing, but there you go. So people metabolize caffeine differently, but some people can say to me, look, I can have 2 espressos with dinner and I fall asleep fine and I stay asleep, so no harm, no foul. Even if that's true, that caffeine will decrease the amount of deep sleep that you get. And we've done some studies where we give you a standard cup of coffee, let's say a strong drip brew of coffee, about 200 milligrams of caffeine. It will drop your deep sleep by about somewhere between 15 to 20% at night. Now, for me to drop your deep sleep by 20%, I would have to age you by about 12 years. Or you could just do it every night with a cup of coffee. The last thing I will note on those 2 other points about alcohol and caffeine is the following. I'm not here to be dictatorial. I'm not here to wag my finger. I'm just a scientist. I have no business telling anyone how to live their life. And for goodness sake, life is to be lived. So, have a drink in the evening every now and again, have coffee when you need. By the way, when it comes to coffee, the dose and the timing make the poison. It's completely fine to have coffee in the mornings. That's A-okay. Just try to cut yourself off 12 hours before you expect to go to bed is a good rule of thumb. But again, I don't want to be sort of, finger wagging here. Live your lives. I'm just here to try and impart the knowledge of sleep so that you can then make informed choices as to how you want to live your life. You don't have to invest in this thing called sleep if you don't want. It's your choice completely. And I'm sorry I feel like I've been barking things at you and I've been shouting at you rather than speaking with you. I just get very excited about sleep. I'm sorry.
I think it's very exciting and very heartening that people have at our exposure something that can make our brain healthier every single day and every single night. I love sleep, and now I love it more thanks to you.
Thank you, Cindy.
And speaking of prophylactics, the virtual audience was asking if sex is good for sleep or not.
Yes.
So you could just give that a thumbs up or thumbs down.
I'll answer it very quickly. So what we found is that sex...
Let's end on a high note.
Yeah, exactly. So sex will improve the quality of sleep. Sex before bed will improve the quality of sleep by about 70%, 70. Caveat.
Live life.
No, wait a second though. Caveat, for the gentleman in the room, it has to be sex that is accompanied by orgasm.
Wow, I wasn't expecting that.
So, and here's the other thing.
What a crescendo.
Well,
you can't make this up.
And here's the other thing. Let's say that you're single and you think, well, what use is that? Thanks very much. It turns out that masturbation will get you about 55% of the way there. So on that
this
note,
is a whole new book.
take good night. I know Forget the alcohol. Just tuck yourselves into bed. You'll be okay.
All right. That's awesome. So listen, thank you again to the Rouse Family Foundation, to KERA. We are a not-for-profit, so you can help by signing up for the BrainHealth Project or supporting us. And please, a wonderful hand to Dr. Walker and
Thank you
Dr.
again.
Chapman.